Hello everyone! Thank you for watching this video. For this video, you will see from start to finish my entire creative process for a specific piece that is part of my vampire series. This work is my interpretation of a Jiangshi, which is basically a Chinese vampire. In older versions of the legends, it did feed on qi, and in most interpretations, it does look and act more like a westernized zombie. In later versions of the stories, instead of feeding on energy, they do feed on blood, probably more due to Western influences. Once again, this is my version, and there are certain choices I made with how I wanted to depict it. In most legends, they are very stiff, and once again, they're more like zombies. They tend to not move very fast, they have a lot of stiffness in their joints, they usually walk with their hands outraised in front of them, kind of like the stereotypical Frankenstein walk. For my lady, I wanted her to be a little more loose, have more movement, and I wanted her to be kind of seductive and dangerous. For the background, I just applied Liquitex heavy-bodied bronze yellow. While the bronze yellow in the background was still drying, I added in a little bit of white so that the color does mix and you get a nice gradient. I also buffed out my lines using a mop brush. These things are great for blending. You do have to make sure the paint is still actually a little wet in order to do the blending. For most pieces, I do actually start with a pencil sketch, but for this one I decided not to. I'm just using a liner brush to kind of create a very generalized idea of how I want my character to look. I am using titanium white on that liner brush, and since this is acrylic paint, if I mess up my initial sketch, it's really not a big deal because it dries super quickly, it's very forgiving, and I can very, very easily fix it. As I do with most of my works, I am using reference photos, one of which I believe was from some kind of Korean beauty ad, and that was the one basically for the pose. The second one was actually a film depiction of a Jiangshi from a really old black and white Chinese movie. Kind of wish I could find it and watch it because the images from them looked pretty sweet. And once again, I'm using Liquitex Heavy Body paint. I like this version of acrylic paint because it is thicker. I can water it down if I want to make it thinner. I personally do not like very thin paint. I don't know why. I just don't like how it moves on the canvas, and I don't like the consistency. When it's too runny, it just doesn't work for me and my style of painting. As you can see, I did actually start my sketch with having the torso and the arms kind of go down to the bottom of the canvas. I quickly nixed that idea and I decided to do kind of a V shape at the bottom because it creates to me, it creates just a better composition. I like the negative space it creates, and I was able to do some pretty cool effects with it later on. Like with the rest of the sketch, I do a very, very simple, basic idea of where the eyes, the nose, and the mouth goes, which this will definitely be refined quite a bit later. And sorry guys, my head does get into the shot quite a bit when I'm working on the face. At least it's when I had purple hair, and it's kind of a fun color to look at. Here I start putting in some of the lighter shading. That bronze yellow that I used for the background is kind of my mid-tone, and it's a good touching point for all of my shading throughout the entire piece. I have noticed a big difference in how I actually shade faces since the whole contouring trend started happening pretty heavily in makeup. I don't know if it's because it gives me a better understanding of facial structure in a more exaggerated way, but I have noticed at certain points in my paintings that they do kind of look like little drag queens. It does get blended out later, but it is kind of entertaining to see the different points of the piece as it goes like that. I start using a deep red for the lips, so I have a basic idea of where that is, and I used some black for the hair, so I kind of get an idea where I want that placed in the piece. I repeat some of the same steps for the hands and arms, so I kind of have an idea of where they go by throwing that white in there. As you can probably tell, I am one of those artists that likes to jump around the piece and work on different parts at the same time. This kind of prevents me from obsessing too much about specific spots, and it also helps me get an idea of the piece as a whole versus just that one little part, which is really important when you're creating something. You want to see the whole thing and not just that one little piece, because sometimes when you focus in too much on that one little piece, you lose the rest of the work. And I also have a tendency to try to get my light points in and my dark points in pretty darn quickly, because it does help me personally know how stuff is going to be placed and where everything's going and what shading I'm using. As you can see, I just keep building general ideas of where stuff goes, and I just keep constructing the piece. For this lady, she is going to have some really, really deep dark circles underneath her eyes, because in every interpretation of a Jiangshi I've ever seen, they do have those very deep dark circles under their eyes. In all interpretations of the Jiangshi, they have those super duper long nails. In Western cultures, they had this belief too, and in old documentations of hunting for vampires, they would actually check the nails on the hands and feet, because if they still grew, that meant that it was an undead creature, because that stuff doesn't keep growing when you're fully dead. Interesting random fact, I know. This piece is very small. It's considered a pocket-sized painting. It is only 4 inches by 6 inches and was done on canvas board that I bought from Utrecht when they were discontinuing their brand, so each one was only like 10 cents or something ridiculous like that. For every 5 you bought, you got 5 free, so I stocked up on these guys pretty darn quick. For this piece, I am using a small liner brush a lot more throughout the whole piece than I typically do. Part of the reason for that is because it is such a small work. And another reason is that there's just a lot of little details I want to get in. I want to get in the little fingers and little veininess on the hands and all that fun stuff. Like with most art, the more layers you have, the better it is. So even if you have a not so good layer, or you're just not very happy with it, especially with acrylic paint, since it is so forgiving, you can just go over it and go over it until you're satisfied with the results. I utilize a lot of lines in my work. I'm not a very photorealistic artist, nor do I really try to be. I'm more inspired by more graphic or more impressionistic work. I tend to be inspired more by comic book or animation art that still has some realistic elements to them. Especially when it comes to color work, I am more of an impressionistic artist in that way. I like having elements of realism, but I'm not a hyper realistic or photorealistic artist, nor do I necessarily want to be. Started adding black to the background to add a little bit more depth and texture to the piece. Underneath, I started defining kind of more jagged lines where the arms and chest area kind of cut off into the background. A nice thing about painting this way is that you can keep reshaping things as you're going. Having the background in at the very beginning makes this much, much easier to do. You can just constantly redefine the shapes like you keep seeing me do in the face. I soften it, I harden it up, and you can even move separate points around due to having that background in to begin with. It is much, much harder to do this if you're doing a graphite drawing or a colored pencil drawing. Doing it in acrylic paint once again, is just so forgiving, and you can change things as you go so easily. I am also throwing in a lot of deep red into the black and into the skin to add a little bit more depth color-wise. I love playing with color. It is honestly my favorite thing about creating. I like using it, and I like putting it in kind of weird places where you typically wouldn't expect to see it. Also, since there is going to be a lot of red at the very end of the piece, utilizing this red earlier on in these layers makes the entire piece far more cohesive. Whenever you can repeat colors in various areas of the work, it does unify everything and it makes it all feel as though it's part of the same piece. And I'm at a point where I just keep repeating the same steps. I add in some lines, I define, I mix different layers of paint over each other, and since it's still wet, it just keeps on blending down. And we just keep going through these couple of steps till we have the finished project. Really, a lot of this piece is just a lot of repetition going on at this point. Since I'm not really doing any new steps at this point, I figured it might be a good time to explain why I wanted to do a vampire series. I've always been fascinated with mythology and folklore, and especially vampires. Almost every single culture has some kind of original myth or legend about vampires, and for some reason, it's always really intrigued me. Also, I think that the idea of vampires kind of speaks in a great way to the human psyche, to the fact that we are all human, but there's also kind of this darkness in us, and that we can all really do bad things if we really needed to. Like, if we had to survive, there are certain things that a lot of people would do that they wouldn't normally do otherwise. Now that you have some slight insight into why I'm creating the series, let's get back to the more technical aspects of this painting. For the yellow in the eyes and then the yellow I'm throwing into the background, I am actually using Winsor Newton Azo Yellow from their professional grade line from 2005 or 2006. Since it was still pretty well sealed, it works pretty darn good still. Here you can see me going in with an acrylic Sharpie and trying to sharpen up a lot of the highlighted areas in the hands. I tend to like to use markers, acrylic and otherwise, in my smaller pieces because they do help me create a little bit more depth, and I have a little bit better control over them than I do with a little brush sometimes. I am absolutely not afraid to use my finger as a blending device for these acrylic markers. It's kind of a nice sensation. It reminds me of finger painting in like preschool and kindergarten. And honestly, I don't care if I get paint on my hands. It's going to happen regardless either way. Since it's acrylic paint, it's water-based, it's going to wash off pretty easily. Also, for smaller bits like this, using my finger blends it out pretty darn well. The Copic marker you saw before I switched over to the white acrylic Sharpie again is actually a Garnet shade. Once again, I wanted to bring more red throughout the piece, and adding that red into the darkness underneath the eyes just adds, once again, more depth, more color, and just more layers. And again, the more layers in a piece, the better. And I'm using a lot of flesh-toned markers of Copic and Prismacolor to help blend out some of the previous shading that I did already in this piece. I also started using burnt umber in a Copic marker, and now I'm also using a light tan Prismacolor marker. These help to create really, really good transition points and to sharpen up things really, really well in these kind of paintings. Also, they work well with acrylic paint. Do not use any non-oil based marker with oil paint because it will straight up ruin your piece. I'm also using a red Prismacolor for some of the fine detailing in the lips, the face, around the bruising, and that little trickle of blood coming out of the mouth. I want to say that this was kind of a cadmium red hue because it looks like it's a way more vibrant one than the deeper, darker red that was almost more of a garnet shade that I was using earlier in the piece. Our subject's starting to come together pretty well here. You're starting to actually see what she looks like. I also darkened up the eyes and around the eyes quite a bit. That piece of footage had to be cut because literally my head was in the way the entire time, and you can't see it, so might as well just take it out. Once again, we're going in with that white acrylic Sharpie. As you can probably tell, I am addicted to using highlights and pure white in my pieces. I think it adds a very, very nice pop. The yellow in the very middle of the eyes was a yellow acrylic Sharpie, which was also cut due to my head being in the entire shot the whole time. I wanted to do very, very yellow eyes, and I wanted them to be super duper bright because I wanted that illusion of her being a nighttime creature and supernatural and awesome. It's actually really hard to see a lot of the steps that I did with the eyes due to recording issues and just how small of details they are. There are actually pupils in there. There's a little bit of orange shading going on at the top of the eyes, and there's a tiny little white line that indicates where the waterline of the eyes are. I've noticed that adding this in does add a really nice, realistic element to the pieces, and it makes the eyes look very wet, which is the texture of what an eye should be. I did start throwing in some bluish purple underneath the eyes with the bruising, and as you can see, I am painting over it again, but you can still see those layers underneath. Once again, it is all about layering here. And I'm just fine-tuning some parts of the face, color-wise, and shading-wise. We are getting into the home stretch here, and this is where I become way more finicky about how everything looks, since it's getting closer to being finished. Which is kind of funny because at the very beginning I'm super duper loose, and I'm always very loose at the beginning with how I create, and then I start kind of buckling down and getting more intense and more finicky with the work. Those white dots you keep seeing me put in and then go over and put in and go over, I was contemplating kind of doing cute little hair accessories with it, and I decided against it. And I decided against including the hair accessories because I couldn't get it to look exactly how I wanted. And if you didn't know what I was doing, you wouldn't know what it was. You'd think I just had some dots in the hair for no reason. I start using a red acrylic Sharpie in order to add a little bit more red and a little bit more dimension in the hair and the nails. And this is my favorite part of the paintings that I've been doing for this vampire series, is where I just splatter some cadmium red hue acrylic paint all over the canvas. I think it adds a wonderful energy to each of the pieces, and it also adds a real sense of unity for this series. Thank you so much for watching this video. Hopefully you liked it. If you did, please hit the like button, and if you want to see more like this, please subscribe and or comment below.